they were in Cox's Bazaar, and they were taking pictures, and they were using that for fundraising purposes. But the idea that they were actually in Myanmar seems a bit far-fetched, but I can talk more about that. The other thing about these guys that's actually quite interesting is that if you compare them to other militant groups operating in South Asia, they are actually the most lethal and effective. And one of the arguments that I develop in the book is that is because they are, in fact, some of the most well-qualified in terms of human capital militants that we see. So their victim yields are consistently higher than other militant groups. And by the way, I don't use the word terrorist, not because I'm a tree hugger, but because, or that I am, somehow a left-wing nut. But when we describe a group as a terrorist organization, we tend to think of them as autonomous, that they pick the targets themselves. And in fact, I prefer to call them a proxy organization. I like to remind people that they are in fact an appendage of the Pakistan military. So but by my not calling them terrorists, I'm actually not giving them a free pass. I'm trying to be deliberate in reminding people that this is more like a specialized infantry outfit than it is an autonomous actor. Even, you could almost argue that the ISI, which is actually an appendage of the Army, there's no such thing as a rogue ISI, they strategically figure out what attack should be carried out. They actually sit down with Lashkar, they figure out who should be on a mission, they figure out what the mission's going to be, and then they also figure out who in the armed forces should be in charge of doing the training, right? So I don't call them terrorists, I prefer to call them a paramilitary or a proxy outfit of the Pakistan Army. And one thing so in the book there's essentially two different arguments that I advance that others haven't. The first is really digging down into what they say about themselves and why. And the second is what I call the domestic politics of the organization. And the domestic politics of the organization, I think, has been really understudied. Most of the people that focus on LET focus upon what it does outside of Pakistan and with what effect and consequence, and of course how. If we only think of the LET as being useful to the deep state for its external operations, we're actually literally missing half of the picture. What Lashkar does domestically is extremely important. And this graph here, in some ways, captures what makes them different. So that middle set of overlapping ovals, these are these Deobandi groups, right? And so you've got, out of the whole, by the way, Deoband in Pakistan, Deobandis in Pakistan look nothing like Deobandis in India. So don't confuse them, not that you would. Your Deobandi ulama, they tend to be pro-state and anti-violence. The long story made short, this comes out of partition. The ulama opposed partition. Once partition happened, some went to Pakistan. They ex post facto revised their position. The same thing was true with Jamaat Islami, right? Once they get to Pakistan, they change their story. They take a similar position about the breakaway of East Pakistan, but those that decide to stay in East Pakistan, they ex post facto rationalize why it's okay for them to now be Bangladeshi Deobandi members. So this is important because all of the different militant groups that are Deobandi in ideology, they share this archipelago of resources like Deobandi masjids, Deobandi madaris or madrasas. This means that they have ulama who issue fatwas that justify what they do. And while it's very common for people to attribute all of these madrasas and mosques to Saudi Arabia, I have a different view on this. The Saudi barbarians, they might provide the seed money for an institution, but the recurrent cost is generally provided by Pakistanis. Like Tajirat, the traders, they don't pay income tax. They will pay their zakat to madrasas, either in cash or in kind. And so by over-attributing the role of Saudis, we are really underestimating the degree to which this is resourced domestically. This is an argument that I think I feel very strongly about. So, and who are we talking about? So we also have this political party, the JUI, right? So the JUI is a Deobandi ulama party. They give political cover to these organizations, so it's not a surprise that in the 2002 fraudulent elections, JUI was a partner in what was then NWFP. It shouldn't be a surprise that we begin seeing the emergence of Islamist militancy or terrorism in Pakistan itself under the watch of the JUI. And the primary perpetrators, as I'll explain, are these Deobandi groups. So JUI gives them cover, and there's a couple of factions of those. Then we have the Afghan Taliban. They are, of course, Deobandi. They're called the Taliban because they were the students that came out of Deobandi Madaris in Pakistan. The Pakistani Taliban, they're also Deobandi. We've got the sectarian groups like Lashkar-e-Tayyaba, Safed Pakistan, and then we have these so-called Kashmiri tanzeems like Huji, Huwa, Han, and so forth. And members will go back and forth. Now, they became closely associated with the Afghan Taliban. We know that in 1998, when President Clinton sent cruise missiles to attack the coast, he didn't kill any Al-Qaeda, but he killed a bunch of Huji boys and some of their ISI handlers. So it was through this connection that these Deobandi fellows forged their tight connections to Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. So some of the early attacks in Pakistan, they were Al-Qaeda in imagination, but they were Deobandi in execution. So in contrast, LET is in this gray circle on the right, and it is an Ahl-i Hadith organization, which is another school of fiqh. Not to be confused with Wahhabis. Wahhabis are actually Hanbali. These guys are actually, they reject all fiqh, but in practice they look and smell, walk and talk quite a bit like Wahhabis. But what makes LET different from the other Ahl-i Hadith organizations in Pakistan, who overall are probably 5% of the population, is that the overall Ahl-i Hadith ulama believe that jihad cannot be waged by non-state actors, and it can only be waged by an Islamic State. What this means is that whereas the Deobandi organizations are very sprawling and have access to all of these institutions and their money, LET cannot access this much smaller infrastructure of mosques and madrasas. So they've had to build their own. From the point of view of command and control, they are much more dependent upon the ISI because of this resource constraint than these Deobandis who have much larger economic reach. And so this is an important story in understanding how LET is really quite different from everyone else blowing up stuff in Pakistan. In fact, LET has never targeted anything in Pakistan. And there's a couple of reasons for that. The other thing that's important to note from this graph is that the folks that are joining the Islamic State are coming from the Deobandi groups, right? So ironically, Islamic State is Salafi, LET is Salafi. LET is at war with Islamic State. And this is actually quite an interesting thing that exists in Pakistan. So most of the folks that are joining Islamic State are coming from these sectarian groups like Safed Pakistan, which is really Lashkar-e-Tayyaba, and now they operate under the name of ASWJ. And they went to Iraq and Syria before al-Baghdadi declared the Caliphate, and they went there because they have this interest in killing Shia. All right, so why are we focusing upon LET? It's fairly evident, but what I do want to draw your attention to is this business card. So this business card is by Yahya Mujahid. I used to meet with him pretty often. And I give this to you because this is to give you a sense of how professional and open they are. If you were to talk to members of your armed forces who capture these fellows or kill them, they even have what they call Shanakbiki cards, identity cards. And the reason why they have these identity cards, you might ask, maybe this is a PSYOP. Well, no, because there are death benefits that are conferred to individuals, right? And so you don't want Jaish al-Mohammed claiming your so-called shaheed, right? So there's a very routinized element to how this and other organizations work. And if you're interested in more mundane aspects of what I would call the personnel management side of things, my colleague Jacob Shapiro wrote this fabulous book called The Terrorist Dilemma, and he's really talking about what are the HR practices of effective terrorist organizations. I think when you think about it in this way, you understand that it actually makes these organizations vulnerable in different ways because they have to maintain records, right? And so I'm going to be presenting data on some of the records that we have from these guys. So the next few slides are going to derive from what I call the so-called Shaheed database that I have. And these data were remarkably easy to collect. The up to 2004. After 2004, it gets really difficult because they know that people like me are looking for it. But then there's interlibrary loan, so it ends up not being that difficult at all in the end. But I have well over 800 of these biographies. And remember that these biographies, they serve multiple purposes. One is to extol the heroism of the individual so killed, but they're also recruitment tools, right? Because they want other people to read, you know, how fabulous, what the Josh was of this dude, so that they might be interested in following in his footprint. So these things necessarily have multiple audiences. This means that we can't take everything they say at face value, right? And they all are using takaluses, or not takaluses, kunyas, or kunya, depending upon whether you use in Arabic or the pronunciation. Because they're using kunyas, we can't just then go to a database of Indian newspapers and cross-reference the attack and see what's truthful and what's not. So the things that I tend to take at face value, and which I've extracted from all of these data, actually with support from the Combating Terrorism Center, where this project began now almost 10 years ago. We take at face value where the fellow is from. There's no reason for me to think that someone would say they're from Gujranwala if they're not. Particularly when you understand the recruitment dimension, right? They want these people to know that this guy from Gujranwala did these important things so that other boys from Gujranwala will follow his footsteps. There's no reason to think that that's fictional. Their age and their education, their jobs, how many siblings they had, whether they were married. These things we take at face value. How many kuffars they dispatched with a dull pencil, we don't take seriously at all. But we will pay attention to some of those aspects narratively in the qualitative analysis. So let's talk a little bit about what this database is and what it's not. So if you were to, does someone have a pencil I could borrow very quickly? It's actually easy to show this way, so thank you. Okay. So to end up in my database, you actually have to die, right? This imposes a quality constraint that you might not appreciate at first blush, right? Ajmal Kasab, everyone says, well, Ajmal Kasab wasn't well educated, and he was a fida'in, and I like to point out, Ajmal Kasab was such a duffer, he failed in his most important task, which was not to kill, it was to be killed, right? Because we don't know anything else about any of the other attackers, but because he had the cowardice to not take a bullet on his chest, as he was instructed to do, we know a lot about this operation. We don't know everything because they're very good. They kept the battle buddies deeply siloed. He knew very little actually about his own battle buddy. He didn't even meet him until Karachi. But because of him, we know that a Navy frogman taught them how to switch boats at high sea. If you talk to your colleagues in the Navy, this is not a trivial thing to do. Remember, these are boys that never knew how to swim, right? So we know a lot because this duffer failed to die, right? So to be in my database, you have to die in an operation, not in an Indian Pansi. He doesn't count in my database. The other thing is that when my brothers joined the U.S. Army, they didn't have to say to the big army, "Hey, I want to go to Iraq." Big Army said to my brothers, "Boys, we trained you. Pack your bag. You're going." These guys don't just end up in Kashmir. You see them, they are bureaucratic entrepreneurs. They have to keep lobbying to get more and more training. And once they've reached a level of training, they then have to lobby the organization to get deployed. And in some cases, we see them going all up to Hafiz Saeed. It's Hafiz Saeed himself that will grant the mission. Sometimes it's Luckfi. And so, by the way, I did give this information to the FBI because they're constantly looking for information about Hafiz being involved. They didn't seem to appreciate it. But that's another story about what we really are doing with our policy with respect to these fellows. So how I characterize this, if we just think of a normal distribution of human capital, what LET is doing is it's lobbing off the biggest dullards, and it's effectively shifting the need, right? So the example I would give, let's say that we looked at the SAT scores of every person that took the SAT, and we then compared it to the SAT scores of your average college graduate. Right? Obviously, the selection effect of them getting into college and graduating is mean that the mean SAT score is going to shift. So the data that I'm going to present, I don't want you to conclude that the data I present represent all of LAT, much less everyone that wants to join LAT, because the guys in my data set have gone through multiple levels of selection that make them special. And that's an important caveat. All right, so this is what the production of LAT fighters overall looks like. And the darker the color, the more LAT fighters are coming from these districts. And so what you can see is that the vast majority, and in fact the majority of LAT fighters are coming from 10 districts in the Punjab. I have a similar map that I've done of Pakistan Army recruitment, and it looks pretty similar. And there's a couple reasons for that. The Pakistan Army recruitment base is actually more diverse because it's got corps headquarters in Karachi, Quetta, and Peshawar, and it has divisional headquarters elsewhere. So you will actually see more diversity coming in the Pakistan officer recruitment than you do in LAT. But one of the reasons why I think they're coming from the same districts, there's a bunch of reasons. One, this is a Punjabi organization. So when they say that we're a Kashmiri Tanzim, I mean, really, they're just full of it. Now, it is possible that they're recruiting ethnic Kashmiris from the Punjab because there are many of those, but we couldn't know that because we only know their Kuniyats, right, or their Kuniyas. The other thing is that when we read their literature, partition weighs very heavily in this literature. And of course, Punjab, bore the brunt of partition-related violence. So it's not a surprise that in their literature we see a lot of references to partition. The other thing is that these guys are very close to the Pakistan Army, and the Pakistan Army has the vast majority of its infrastructure in the Punjab. But I think one of the most important reasons why they have such similar district recruitment is that they're actually recruiting people with similar human capital. So in the second column, I have the education, and these are, by the way, this is not madrasas, this is regular education. In that column, I have the education distribution of the fighters in the database. And in all those other columns, I'm comparing them to Pakistani males over 10 years, because that's how the census breaks them out. Whether they're Pakistani males in general, whether they're from a rural or urban area, or whether they're from the Punjab in general, or Punjab, rural, or urban. And what we see is that only 1.3% are illiterates, right? So in other words, the Ajmal Kasabs are statistically quite rare. But if you look at Pakistani male overall, who's above the age of 10 years old, you will see anywhere between, the lowest is 21% in urban Punjab is illiterate. And if we're just looking at rural Pakistanis in general, we're looking more at 36% are illiterate. So this means that my fellows, just like I was showing you in this graph, are very unlikely to be illiterate relative to the population from which they draw. If we look at the matriculates, 44% of my fellows are matriculates. This is something that most Pakistani males don't actually get to. The lowest is about 11%, and that's going to be for rural Pakistani males. And the largest we see is 17% for urban males. So these guys are much more likely to have their matriculation. And if we look at the FA and above, about 17% of them are. And you can see that the highest percentage is for urban males, and they're at 19%. So overall, what we're seeing is what I told you here, is that they've shifted the mean. So on average, my fellows in my database, and sorry ladies, I'm not being sexist, they're all fellows, are much better educated than the communities from which they draw. But puzzlingly, they are less likely to be full-time employed. So we do see a lot of underemployment. So it's at this point when my colleagues in USAID says, well, let's just give them jobs and they won't be terrorists. Well, the problem with this is, if you really want to be a Lashkar, you are not going to take full-time employment. You're going to seek a job that allows you to run off for 3 months and do the requisite training. I see this all the time. I teach in the U.S., in Washington, D.C. My students that are expecting security clearances, they don't take a job that commits them because they're basically waiting to get that call for their real government job, right? So we actually see this in other labor markets where people are choosing to be underemployed because that gives them the flexibility that they require to do this kind of training. So I do not think that we can just simply conclude, give these guys jobs, and everything becomes hunky-dory. I actually think the unemployment reflects their choice to be a militant rather than their unemployed status drives their options to be a militant. So why do these guys fight? So, and this is sort of switching from the quantitative aspects to the qualitative aspects of the biographies. So there are many reasons that they fight that have nothing to do with Islam. So by the way, pedagogically, I don't use the word radical. Radicalized to me means we stop thinking of them as rational. So I don't tend to, I tend to, my training is more moored in that of labor economics, where we say people have a cost-benefit analysis that they're undertaking. We may not subscribe to their costs and benefits, but just because we disagree with them doesn't mean that they're radical or crazy or what have you. And what I see when I look at these biographies, there's a degree to which they look like the young men that joined the U.S. Army. And by the way, my brothers are Army recruiters, and I used to do Army recruitment when I worked at the Rund Corporation. So I tended, having gone through this stuff, I actually find the military recruitment literature to be much more helpful in understanding this puzzle than any of the radicalization stuff that I've read. So the first thing is a lot of these young men, they are bored. They think that the life that they're leading is just not interesting, that somewhere out there is something, a higher calling for them. We have the same thing in the U.S. Army. It's reduced to a joke. Join the U.S. Army, travel the world, meet interesting people, and kill them, right? And to give you a sense of why I'm serious, right? And my brothers are recruiters. This is one thing. Like, Fort Wayne is a really shitty town. You want to live the rest of your life in Fort Wayne, Indiana, son? No, you don't. Join the U.S. Army. They're not saying, you know, fight for Uncle Sam. They're not saying fight for your First Amendment rights or your Second Amendment rights or my 19th Amendment right. It took 19 amendments to get me the right to vote, by the way. They're certainly not fighting for the 19th Amendment. They are going for very mundane reasons. And the other thing that you'll see is that sometimes they're kind of making up for bad choices that they had made previously, right? That they were kind of a Landa La Funga. They felt really guilty about that. Maybe someone died. And they're trying to redeem themselves. And so these are things that really have nothing to do. This could have been any organization, right? These are just things that motivated these young men. Often they're being motivated by someone that they respect. Maybe a friend in college, maybe a cousin, maybe a brother is yanking them in. By the way, my brothers will tell you in the U.S. Army, this is also how we get folks in boots. It's called the buddy system. It's called the influencer network. Then you have things that are very specific to Islam and the way Islam is believed in Pakistan. And if I were talking about the Khalistan movement, I would now move to things that are rooted into beliefs about Sikhism. If I were looking at Christian militants, I would do this from the Christian Bible point of view. So I'm not signaling out any religion. I'm just saying that since this is an Islamist group, there are things that we cannot say are anything but pertaining to the interpretation of Islam that these individuals have. And the first is this idea that no matter what you do, you, just by crossing the LOC and getting killed by an Indian, you become a martyr. And by virtue of becoming a martyr, no matter what you did, the minute before that bullet hits you on the chest, that magical Hindu bullet, you get to go to Jannah, right? You could have been a rapist, a druggie, a pimp, but once that Hindu bullet hits you, now you go to Jannah. And the second thing that's quite interesting, and this is something that Pakistanis believe, it's not just about becoming a martyr, also they believe this about once you become a hafiz, someone who's memorized Quran, you get to go to Allah and say, I want these people to come to heaven with me. So it's basically a get to heaven free card. And this is where things get really perverse. The mothers in these biographies, because many of these are told from the eye of the mother, she'll say, I told my son to take a bullet on my chest, on his chest. I told him, don't come back a ghazi, which is to say a veteran. I want you to become a shaheed. Because I want you to go to Allah and tell me, or tell him to take me to Jannah. Now, this is actually pretty perverse, right? Because this is one lazy mother. You want to go to Junit? Why does your son have to take a bullet? You know, there's lots of things you could do. But sending your son to take a Hindu bullet doesn't have to be one of them. And the other thing that the mothers will say, it's not just the mothers, the fathers will say it, but especially the mothers, they'll say, I want the status of being the mother of a shaheed. This is the highest status. And interestingly enough, when someone says that this woman is a mother of a shaheed, they make no distinction between a mother of a shaheed of a Lashkar and the mother of a shaheed who died in a regular Pakistan Army operation, right? So there is no hierarchy of mothers of shaheeds, right? So again, this is kind of the opposite of what we think of a nurturing mother, right? This is actually a very selfish, callous cow of a mother, right? How many mothers that you know would do this? And so this raises questions of whether or not the mothers actually feel this way, or whether they're just rationalizing their loss after the fact. But with respect to the status, this is for real. I mean, you go to villages where someone has become a so-called shaheed, and they'll have wells built in his honor. So there's something more there than simply propaganda. The other things that draw them are even they're less having to do with Islam than about South Asian history of Islam, right? So they'll talk about the two-nation theory, they'll talk about the Hindu occupiers, they'll talk about the need to liberate the poor Indian Muslim who's downtrodden, right? So this is not about, you know, global Ummah issues, this is really about South Asia, but it is very much about their experience as a South Asian Muslim. The thing that becomes very clear when you start reading this stuff is how much the families matter to this organization. And so this is very different from the Taliban. Taliban, they're not recruiting families. And again, this is a lot like what my brothers see when they're recruiting for the U.S. Army. We recruit young men at the age of 16. That's why we're not signatories to the Children Warriors Convention. We know that if we let them graduate from high school, they have better things to do, and we won't meet our mission. So we in fact, both of my brothers signed on the line at 16, and I often will quip, if we're not going to say the U.S. Army radicalized my brother at 16, we shouldn't say LET radicalized, you know, Abdul whoever at 16, because they're doing very similar things. My brothers had no interest in killing. They were taught to kill once they joined, right? And this, I think this is also true mostly of these Lashkar kids. They're looking for something, they're taught to kill only after they join. And in fact, out of the 10 or so people that they'll train, only one will actually be employed in operation. The vast majority of them will go back to their home as a part of this domestic politics of this organization. So they spend a lot of time going after the parents. They want the parents to give permission. They tell the boys to get permission. When the boy dies, it's a solemn affair to go to the home and notify them. Again, when families of the U.S. Army, they dread the nice car pulling up and the well-dressed man or woman who knocks on their door, because no one does that to bring you good news about your daughter or son in the Army. It's only bad news. And the way they describe coming and notifying the family of the shaheed is with that same sense of gravitas and honor. And that struck me as, again, part of the sort of HR practice of the organization. They want to keep the family in the fold. Not only do they want to keep the family in the fold for operational reasons, to continue to be willing to give money to support the organization, and even give other male family members. What people have to remember is that this organization is not just about jihad, it's also about dawah, or dawah, depending upon which pronunciation you prefer. So they have a proselytization mission, because they want to expand the number of adherents to their creed, which is why 9 and 10 will never be deployed, but they'll be sent back home to do tabligh and dawah. So not only do they want to revere the family, but they also want to make sure that the family does not recidivate and go back to being Deobandis or Barelvis. Right? So this is also a part of eyes on the organization. And they also don't want the family to be out of pocket for the loss. So we do know that there's different amount of money that either the ISI or the organization gives to the families. There's no strict hard fast rule. Like they have different schemes. Like at certain points in time, if you cross the LOC, we'll give you 2 lot. If you take a Hindu bullet, we'll give you 5. It's really, they offer these different schemes. So across time, we can't really say on average how much these families are getting from the ISI as well as from the organization. I think we just talked about that. So I'm really blind, so I actually can't see my slides, so I'm just kind of going from memory. All right, so let's talk about the other 9 that goes back to their district. And going back to that first slide that I showed you, where you have these different maslaks, or these different interpretive traditions. So why is LET so important to the state domestically? Well, this is something that doesn't get a lot of play. They are militantly anti-violence in Pakistan itself. And their manifesto, Hum Kyun Jihad Kar Rahe Hain, Why Are We Waging Jihad, makes this very, very clear. They will first concede, and it's an interesting book. It's like you must have seen it. It's like the Socratic method. You have this jihadi asking pretty stupid questions, and then you have this alim who is pandering and using this as an opportunity to make important points. So the book really starts out with, okay, all these other places are terrible, India's terrible, Afghanistan's terrible, Saudi Arabia's terrible, but what about Pakistan? Pakistan's terrible. No one is a good Muslim here. Why don't we wage jihad in Pakistan first? Right? So they are appreciating the most obvious question, why don't we clean up our own backyard before we go and get in our neighbor's business? And so this whole book is really about telling people why we don't do that. And they offer different kinds of examples. So they'll say there are those persons that they certainly commit shirk. So the Barelvis, they call them stone worshippers. They commit shirk because they attribute to the Prophet things that should be reserved for Allah. Absolutely, they're shirk. They'll talk about the munafiqs. These are the people that spread discord. And one kind of person that would be that example would be Shia, right? Because they spread discord about the rightful succession of the Prophet. They talk about the kuffar, the polytheists, right? Which was you and me, since I'm an atheist. We fall in that category. But they say, within Pakistan, there is to be no violence against these persons. The only thing that they should be subjected to is dawah and tabligh, right? Which is to say, conversion. And this is where the JUD, which is what most Pakistanis call this organization, no one calls them LET anymore. That's just something that people in India and the United States and elsewhere call them. This is where their so-called human services, and they actually do provide human services. The ISI exaggerates this tremendously. The ISI is greatly vested in making these guys appear more effective in their relief delivery than they actually are. And I saw this, I was in Pakistan when the Kashmir earthquake happened, when the flood happened, and if you were a reporter and you wanted to go cover the earthquake, you had to go through the Ministry of Interior, ISPR, and the ISI even has like a dude, it's always a dude, who arranges your travel. And you don't say, I want to go to here, here, and there. They take you in their helicopter or their car, and you go and interview the people that they want you to interview. It annoys me that journalists never tell the truth about this. They act as if, I just took my motorcycle and ended up at this JUD camp providing relief. So if you look at the reportage of the Kashmir earthquake, you would get the impression that the jihadis were doing all of the big relief. The World Bank, turns out, lifted the skirt up on this slide. They interviewed 256,000 households. In other words, they basically did a complete census of households that were affected along the fault line of the earthquake. They found 256 households that had actually been given aid by a militant organization. All of those households were in Muzaffarabad, right? So in other words, LET just rolled out. And ISI brought all of the journalists there so they could go back and write in the New York Times about how awesome the jihadis are. They did the exact same thing in the floods. I was there in the floods. I saw it. In fact, I was even taken to some of these places by the Ministry of Information. But the difference is that I'm not a journalist, and I'm not trying to act like, I'm G.I. Jane. So they spend a lot of effort making this organization function within Pakistan and making us believe it functions within Pakistan. And the reason is that they are militantly opposed to sectarianism. unlike the Islamic State and the Deobandis, which practice takfir, which is declaring someone to be a kuffar, and then wajibul qatl, liable to be killed, this organization doesn't accept this at all. And in fact, there are these really funny, if you have a warped sense of humor like I do, essentially Islamic State is calling LET a bunch of cussies, because they won't call anyone a kuffar, or they don't practice takfir. And LET is like, well, we're not really cussies, we just have a very high standard of what it means, and our standard says that no matter how terrible a person is, they can't be killed. So these debates that go back and forth are actually, I find them to be quite amusing. But when you understand this, the LET domestically is seen as a very important tool in fighting this violence that's taking place across the state. And this is an argument that I made a number of years ago, but then when they fielded the Milli Muslim League, this argument comes out very clearly, not from someone who thought about it theoretically based upon their literature, but they actually then begin to say so. So the Tabassum Qayyum, very interesting guy. He had very bad internet hygiene. You could go and see him being trained by Falana Colonel. He had been involved with the Pakistan Khuda Office publication, and he put this on his LinkedIn. This was on his LinkedIn page. Like, the dude thought this was like perfectly cool to like list in his professional CV on LinkedIn. Well, he does his MA at Pakistan's NDU, and if you haven't, for those of you who are interested in this, I highly encourage you to go to Pakistan NDU's website, put in Tabassum Qayyum's name, and his thesis will come up. And he lays out, actually in a very compelling way, how the only way the Pakistanis can defeat the Takfiris, like the Deobandis and the Islamic State, is through Jamaat al-Dawa. And so, if you fast forwarding a little bit in Mr. Qayyum's professional trajectory, he then becomes a spokesperson for the Milli Muslim League, right? So I argue in this book that it's very interesting what they do outside of Pakistan, because they do it on the command of the ISI. They're not rogue operators. But if we only look at that we're really underestimating the value that this organization has domestically to the state. And that's the end of my formal presentation. Thank you for your patience and indulgence.
Thank you very much.